Good morning and hello everyone. Welcome back into Senior Living Live. My name is Melissa. Thanks for being with us today for our webinar called When is it time for senior living? We have an unofficial motto, if you will, at the Arbor Company. We say, don't wait until there's an emergency before you begin discussing senior living options with an aging loved one. That is so key and so important. It is kind of what we're talking about here today. Our guest presenter, Chris Lyboldt, will discuss this as well as other common scenarios you may encounter where senior living might be the best option. Now, Chris will be available to answer all of your questions following his presentation. To participate in the Q&A session, all you have to do is scroll down to the bottom of your screen where it says Q&A. Feel free to type all of your questions out there, and I will be happy to read those to Chris at the end of the webinar. We'll make sure we get to all of them today. By the way, this webinar is expected to last about an hour. So good to see all of you here today. Chris, good to see you as well. Thank you so much for being with us. The floor is all yours.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Melissa, and good morning to everybody. I'm just going to share my screen here so that you can see my presentation. So today's topic is when is it time for senior living? And before we get started, I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Chris Lyboldt, and I'm an elder care consultant, and I own a company called Senior Care Authority here in Atlanta. And I wanted to share with you a little bit about how I became an elder care consultant and why it's become my favorite passion in life. So as soon as I came out of college, I started to teach at New York University. I was an instructor there. And the areas that I taught was in the education department. So I did a lot of work with teachers, and I did kind of train the trainer work. I taught them how to teach, and I did a lot of facilitation work. And naturally now, as an elder care consultant, that's really helped me a lot because much of the work that I do is around coaching and teaching and facilitation. After 12 years, I got married and decided that I needed to make a little bit more money than an instructor at New York University made. So I went into the corporate world and I became a director of sales and marketing in a distribution organization. And I did that for 17 years. And I learned a lot about marketing and sales. And that's, of course, also helped my business because it's great to do the work, but you also have to make sure that you're always generating new business as well. So both of those things then led to this point where the organization that I was working for said, your organization's no longer a fit. And I needed to figure out what I was going to do in transition. Meanwhile, my wife and I had been a caregiver for my father-in-law, Bob, and that's the gentleman that you see there in the picture. And we had been taking care of him for 6 years. And we had gone through every single obstacle that you could imagine with Bob, trying to figure out what can we do to give this man that we love so much the best possible life that he could have. And we ended up figuring out a great solution. We ended up moving him into independent living. But through that whole entire process, we learned so much about the world of elder care and senior living. And that led me to Senior Care Authority and my role as an elder care consultant. So before we get started, I wanted to talk a little bit about wants and needs. So when I'm working with my clients, very often they're all adult children. And the adult children, the first question they say is, Chris, I really think that it's time for mom to make a move, but how do I have that conversation with her? How do I even bring it up? And this is kind of the way that I structure it, or that I coach my clients through it. Generally, the way that it works, and this, of course, there's no rules, these are generalizations, is that the older loved one, the aging loved one, usually wants to maintain their independence. That's a real priority. One of the worst things that can happen is when an older adult has to retire from driving, or when they have to move out of the home that they've lived in for 30 years. Those are very, very difficult moments in this whole entire transition. And very often it's easy to forget that. It's easy to forget that really at the heart of all of this is our aging loved ones' desire to remain independent. They may be in their 80s, their 90s, but in their hearts, they still feel like they're younger. They still feel like they're in their 30s or, in the prime of their life. And that's something that's always important to remember. On the other side, with the adult children, they have a very particular want as well. They've noticed that moms maybe had some accidents or some things have been happening in the home, and their primary want is safety. And they want to make sure that mom can be safe. And the adult child sometimes can forget about what mom and dad's wants really are, and that's independence. And they can begin to force the issue of when it's time to actually make that move. But really, there's a central need. There's a central need that older adult has. And that is dignity. I call this the pursuit of dignity. And when we're making a move, or when we're trying to figure out what it is, everything's about preserving the dignity of that individual. That may be around independence. It may be around healthcare. It may be around not being isolated. It may be around memory care. There's so many things that we can do to preserve that dignity. And it's important for adult children to realize that when they're having these very important conversations with their mom or their dad, that they do so in a way that's always preserving their dignity. So I just kind of wanted to set the stage there as this is the way that we should be approaching it anytime that we're talking about it. So I'm a storyteller, and I think probably the best way to talk about, when is it time to move into senior living is through stories. So these are 3 actual clients of mine. I changed their names, of course, but these 3 stories really capture 3 different scenarios that I think have a whole bunch of different substance to them. And you may relate to the older adult, you may relate to the adult child, you may be a friend, you may be a spouse. Hopefully these stories resonate for you in some way. So the 3 stories I've titled A Zest for Living, and that's a story about Mrs. Vick. I've Earned It, that's a story about Mr. Rose, and Freedom to Thrive, and that's a story about Mr. Mill. So let's start with Mrs. Vick. So Mrs. Vick, she's 92 years old, and she was living alone in a condo in Minnesota. Her daughter lived in Atlanta and reached out to me because she was under the impression that it was time for Mrs. Vick to make a transition. Now, Mrs. Vick was incredibly social. She'd have dinner with a bunch of friends every Friday night, and every single Saturday night, they'd all go out to the casino and they'd play the slot machines. She loved going out. She loved her happy hours. And again, she was 92. She was very, very active. And she met with her friends regularly throughout the week as well. Well, then the pandemic hit, as it hit all of us. And suddenly that social life that she was so accustomed to was impacted. And she had to continue to cook and clean. She had to continue to run errands. She had to maintain her condo. She had to pay her bills. She had all of these different things that she was constantly engaged in. And she was just getting a little tired of having to do all of those things. All of those things began to give her some anxiety. And without the input and the extra energy that she was getting from her friends, she came to the conclusion that, yes, you know what? Maybe it is time for me to explore something else. So she came here to Atlanta, and we decided to do a tour. And we toured an independent living community. And she insisted that we do the tour during happy hour, which I thought was very funny. It was the only time I've ever done a tour where the person that I was touring actually did the whole tour with a gin and tonic in her hand as the ice was jingling throughout the entire tour. I thought that was very enjoyable. she met all the people at the happy hour. Everybody that saw her was embracing her and was talking about the community. She saw the list of all the activities that she could participate in on a daily basis. And she just fell in love with this independent living community. And she was going to be able to see her daughter on a regular basis. It was no longer trips back and forth from Minnesota to Atlanta. So all of these things clicked for Mrs. Vick, and she decided to make the move. And she moved into that independent living community from Minnesota, and she is doing fantastically right now. So I just kind of want to summarize some of the things in that story that really motivated and helped Mrs. Vick come to the decision that she was ready for a move. So the first was a desire for more social interaction. And when somebody's making the decision about whether or not I should move into independent living, that very often is a top priority. They find themselves getting into a habit of sitting around and watching a lot of television and not engaging in a lot of activities. So that desire for social interaction is always a big one. She wanted freedom from the daily chores of life. When you move into independent living, you get 3 square meals a day. They provide housekeeping for you. They'll clean your sheets usually once a week. They maintain your room. You don't have to worry about paying all these bills because you've got basically one single bill. So those freedom from daily chores were also very, very important to her. She had the desire to participate in more activities. She never missed she still to this day has not missed a happy hour, but she wanted to go take tours into the North Georgia mountains, and she wanted to go shopping, and she wanted to go out to restaurants, and independent living provides those kinds of opportunities. She was lonely. She used to see a lot of her friends when she was in Minnesota, and because of external circumstances that had to come to a close. She's now one of the most popular people at this particular independent community, and that loneliness that she was battling has now been greatly reduced. She got to move closer to her daughter. She and her daughter have a terrific relationship. So that was something that was very important, moving closer to a family. And she didn't require any kind of assistance. I couldn't even keep up with her on the tour. That's how quick she was. My heart rate was probably 130 degrees when we finished it. She's that kind of a woman, just an absolute spark plug. And the kind of community that was ideal for her was independent living. So that's the first story, Mrs. Vick. Let's move to our second story. And that is the story of Mr. Rose. And I've titled this story, I've Earned It. So Mr. Rose, he was also in his early 90s, and he'd been living with his son and his son's wife for several years after his wife had passed. He had his own room in the house. Everything was great. But as the years passed, he was getting to a point where he needed more help. He needed more help with his daily activities. He needed help getting around because he needed help sometimes standing, and he used a walker. Sometimes he needed some help getting from his bed to his walker. He needed help sometimes getting into the shower, needed help with, getting his socks on, and sometimes, just some simple things with getting dressed. And, so suddenly when, Mr. Rose moved in, at first they were kind of roommates, but it was beginning to evolve into a situation where Mr. Rose's son and his wife were more and more becoming caregivers for Mr. Rose. And even though he didn't need a lot of help, it was becoming difficult for the family to manage everything else that they had going on in their lives while taking care of Mr. Rose. And Mr. Rose had fallen a few times, and that had really frightened him. And then sadly, Mr. Rose's son got some bad news. His wife sadly was diagnosed with cancer, and suddenly she was the one that was requiring a tremendous amount of caregiving. And Mr. Rose was in a position where he began to say, geez, I'm looking at all of these things. I need more help with my daily activities. My son and my wife, they're devoting so much time to taking care of me, and I am getting into a habit where I'm sitting around watching a lot of television. Maybe it's time for me to make a move. So Mr. Rose and his son, they reached out to me, and we decided to look at assisted living. So I introduced him to the assisted living, and we were in the initial meeting there with the community engagement director. and I offered Mr. Rose a wheelchair. And his son was like, "Oh, I'm sure my dad doesn't need a wheelchair. He's fine. He gets around everything." And Mr. Rose, he looked up to all of us. He goes, "I'm going to take the wheelchair. I've earned it." And I just thought that was the greatest thing, because at 92, I can tell you, he certainly had. But we began to introduce him to the community, and he saw kind of all the people that would be taking care of him. He met a bunch of people. He was a veteran, and there were a lot of other veterans in that community, and he had a great time. Everybody was vibrant. You know, they needed a little bit more care, but everybody in that community and that culture in that community was just so wonderful that he felt like he fit right in. And they decided that they were going to move into that assisted living. So one of the things that Mr. Rose, before he moved in, had an issue with is that he had a concept of what assisted living was. And his concept of what assisted living was is that it was a nursing home, and that assisted living is a place where there's all these machines and there's all these buzzers going off all the time. And, you know, there's nurses buzzing around and doctors buzzing around. And in reality, you know, assisted living is quite the opposite of that. You know, you still have the ability to maintain your independence, even though you are getting some support with some of those daily activities that you might need some help with. And once he was in there and he saw that assisted living, he realized that. He was like, "Oh, yes, this would be a great situation." He was ready to move in that day. By the end of the time we got to the end of conference, he was ready to go. So it felt like home, but a home where he could get the assistance he needed with his daily activities, where he could interact with a group of like-minded men and women, and where he could recapture that relationship with his son, of father to son and caregiver to patient. And for both of them, for his son and for Mr. Rose, that was really important. So that's the story of Mr. Rose. Let's go in a little bit and break down some of those reasons that Mr. Rose chose to make this move. Number one, again, just like it was with independent, it was that desire for more social and recreational activity. He had recognized that he was getting into a bit of a rut. You know, he recognized on his own that his family members were becoming caregivers for him. And, you know, he realized that even though I'm sure that they would be willing to continue to do that forever and ever, he realized that he wanted to recapture and reclaim that relationship that they used to have, where they could just be father and son and father and daughter-in-law, and that caregiving wasn't at the heart of that relationship. He also understood that he needed help with a few things, you know, that it would be good if somebody could help him with some of his mobility issues and help him get to the shower. We call that transferring. And just some help, maybe minor help getting dressed. And he could benefit from a medication management program. He had a regimen of medications, and the assisted living could provide that for him. He had a desire to improve his health. He knew that if he became more active and he began to work with physical therapy and occupational therapy, and he began to participate in the activities and the exercises that they had at the assisted living, there was a possibility that his health would actually improve. And of course, when your cognitive health improves, your physical health improves as well. He also had a fear of falling again, and he wanted to get into a safer environment. And then lastly, he did need some assistance with what we refer to as ADLs, and those are activities of daily living. So those were really the reasons that for Mr. Rose, it was time to make a move into senior living. And his choice was assisted living, where he would be able to get the care that he needed. All right, let's move to the final story here. And that story is with Mr. Milton. And the title of that story is A Freedom to Thrive. So Mr. Milton, he was living in the Villages down in Florida. And he had a fall, and he hit the back of his head, and there were just some other things that were going on in the home that were raising some concerns for his family. So the family members, they decided that maybe it was best for their dad to move in with one of them. And that's where they started. So they decided to sell the condo down there in the Villages, and Mr. Milton moved in with one of the family members. And it moved in with his daughter, who was very, very busy. And they decided that they were going to make another transition to Atlanta. And the whole family decided that they were going to move him into a cottage in an independent living community. And this cottage was totally separate from the main building. And the family decided that this was absolutely the best thing for Dad to move. And to appease his family, he agreed to do so. So I just want you to note that in the first two stories, there's a big difference here. When I was talking about that continuum of wants and needs, and it's the pursuit of dignity. In those first two stories, Mrs. Vick was the one that really made the decision that she was going to move into independent living. And Mr. Rose, he came to that decision on his own, that he was ready to make that move. Well, with Mr. Milton, it wasn't quite like that. It was the family that was really driving the bus, and they were making the decisions for him. And that impacted him, and it caused him to be a bit depressed about the whole entire thing. So he was in this large cottage that was separate from the main community, and he began to isolate himself. He began to self-isolate, and things began to change for him. He began to order his food from the cafeteria rather than making the walk over to the cafeteria in order to get it himself. He spent all day long watching ESPN on a couch. He began to lose a ton of weight, and he was becoming more and more anxious each and every single day. And he was becoming more depressed. And he was becoming aware in his own mind that the tasks that used to be very, very simple for him were becoming more and more complex, overwhelmingly complex. Things like working a microwave oven, or remembering that he had an appointment, or organizing his mail into junk mail, what's bills, and what's just other mail. He also began taking the food that he had, and he would freeze it. And he would freeze it in his freezer because he didn't want it to go to waste. He grew up in an era where you eat everything on your plate, and that was very important to him. And he was nervous that the garbage wasn't going to be taken out in time. So his son contacted me and shared with me this story, and I went over and I began to meet with Mr. Milton. And I quickly realized that Mr. Milton needed some help, and I had a heart-to-heart with the family and explained to them that probably it would be best if they worked with their doctor in order to get some kind of an evaluation. And that's what they did. And sadly, he was diagnosed with very early onset Alzheimer's. And a lot of the behaviors that he was engaging with suddenly began to make some sense. So the family, who was in denial about all of this, was understandably upset, but they were willing to explore other options. They realized that it was time. So we began to tour assisted living memory care communities. He was so early on in his Alzheimer's that he could move into assisted living, but knowing that memory care was attached to it was very, very important to him. It also offered all of the assistance that Mr. Milton needed beyond memory care. He needed some help with transferring. He needed help with medication management, and needed help with all of these things. So, and at the end of the day, Mr. Milton was the one that realized that he needed help. And through lots of different conversations, and good conversations that his family began to have with him, Mr. Milton realized that he needed more social interaction, that he needed some help with those daily tasks that he was struggling with. And he realized, on his own volition, yeah, I'm going to make a move. I want to make a move. And now, believe it or not, I became a good friend with Mr. Milton after he moved into the assisted living. To this day, I still visit him every single Friday. We have pizza together. We talk about things. And he gained back all of the weight. And he began going down to the dining room every single day, 3 times a day. He began to interact with all of these people. He even got to a point where he organized a football viewing party, which is something that he never would have done when he was self-isolating. He used to be a football player. He played for Purdue in the 50s. So his mood began to radically change. You know, suddenly he went from depression to I would kind of talk about it as a kind of joy. You know, he was around a bunch of other people that were experiencing similar things. So he no longer needed to be embarrassed about some of the things that he was struggling with because everybody else could relate. So matter of fact, the other day, just last Friday, we had him over to my house for spaghetti bolognese, which is his favorite meal. And as he was leaving, he was showing me his pickleball moves. Literally, he's come that far. And it was because you know, everybody recognized that it was time for him to begin to look at some different things. So let's go back and look at Mr. Milton in a little bit of detail. So Mr. Milton, these were some of the reasons and why the family was considering that maybe it was time to make a move into senior living. Mr. Milton was engaging in unsafe behavior. So he was getting lost throughout the day. There were some instances where he had left the stove on and he had left the water running. As I said, you know, he began hoarding some food in the refrigerator, which is something that he had never done in the past. He began to exhibit a lot of extreme anxiety about bills and different things. And he began to get confused about time and place. There were a couple of instances where when I began working with him, where he would call me at 3 a.m. in the morning and he would think that it was during the day. He began to dislike taking showers, which is very common with folks that are getting to that point. And there was this escalating family concern about Dad's ability to live. So, you know, sometimes, you know, Alzheimer's it's such a difficult disease, and the signs are not always incredibly blatant. And, you know, I've shared you the story about this family. You know, they didn't recognize it until somebody that was used to being around this a lot was able to kind of help them see it. But, you know, it's important if you're an adult child and if you're an older adult, if you're beginning to struggle with some of these things, it may be time to have a discussion with your primary care physician, and it might be time to see about whether or not a move into an assisted living or maybe into a memory care is a good move. I call that freedom to thrive, the story, because living alone when you're dealing with dementia is incredibly difficult. It's really a disease about executive functions or your ability to run your life. And it became freeing for him when he could move into a community where all of those things were taken care of for him and he could just live his life. And he had people around him that were dealing with the same thing and he could talk to them about that. So that's the reason that story is titled Freedom to Thrive. So in summary, I just kind of want to break down these 3 different scenarios. And there is no formula for this. And there's no specific checklist that would apply to every single individual and every single scenario. But they generally fall into 3 different scenarios. The first, that's when no assistance is needed, but living alone is no longer a preference. So that would be the story of Mrs. Vick. If what you're looking for is more social interaction and you're looking for freedom from the daily chores of living, and you want to be introduced to a whole new group of friends, then independent living is sometimes a very, very good choice for you. And there's different types of independent living. Some independent livings are resort style living, where you've got swimming pools and saunas and happy hours and pubs and lots of different activities. It's the equivalent of living on a cruise ship. Other independent livings are more residential in nature. And you need to kind of look at, who am I and what kind of a culture would I fit better into? Am I somebody that likes that constant activity, or am I somebody that prefers I want to be able to get away from everybody and keep to myself a little bit. So you've got independent living that can cater to both of those needs. So that's independent living. The next one is if some assistance is needed with one of 5 activities of daily living. And the 5 activities of daily living that are often looked at are dressing. So as I said, with Mr. Rose, it could be as simple as getting your socks on or different things because your mobility is limited. Transferring means the movement of an older loved one from a bed to a walker or from a bed to a wheelchair. It's where you need some assistance in actually standing and pivoting or physically moving. Bathing, sometimes it's very, very, the shower can be a real trip hazard. So sometimes it's bathing where they actually need assistance with it. Other times it's just monitoring. It's help me get to the shower and then leave me alone. I want to shower on my own. And of course, they will accommodate all of those needs. Incontinence, that's kind of when you get to be a little bit further along and your needs are increased. And then, of course, this is far down the line, but when you actually need assistance with physically being fed, that is also considered to be an activity of daily living. And medication management is not an activity of daily living, but sometimes that's something else that happens. So when you're thinking about, is it time? You don't need to have all of these, but 1 or 2 of these things, if they're really impacting upon your ability to live safely in your own home or safely in a cottage, like Mr. Milton was, then it might be time to consider moving into an assisted living. And as I said before, assisted livings by no means are they like nursing homes. You still can have as much independence in that as you'd like. Then the third piece is when there is a diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment or the early onset of dementia. And what's required there is guidance and monitoring. And again, that becomes an issue of safety and protecting and there's signs. And I pointed out to be some of those signs, but any of those signs could be food spoilage, look in the refrigerator, a big stack of bills because there's this struggle to organize how to handle the mail. Sometimes it's hygiene, sometimes it's just a difference in behavior, unexplained anxiety. So for the adult children on the line, these are some of the signs, and I would encourage you that if you're beginning to recognize these, to reach out to your doctor, the older loved one's doctor or a professional, to see if maybe it might be time to get some kind of an evaluation to see exactly what's going on. And then coming back to what I was saying, this was the first slide that I went through, and that is that we always want to remember that the top priority is the dignity of the older loved one. It's that wants and needs thing. And if you're an adult child, you want to approach those conversations very delicately. You want to make sure that when you're having those conversations with the older loved one, that's not forced. Pay attention to their body language. If you can sense that they're really struggling with the topic, well, then change the topic and move on to something else. It's baby steps when you have these conversations with an older adult. It takes time and it takes patience. And even though, down deep, you may be struggling with a bunch of anxiety because you want mom and dad to be safe, at the end of the day, you really want you want them to be a participant in this decision, because when they are and they own it, they're going to be much happier because they've made that decision. And then if you're the older adult, I would recommend that you open yourself up to these conversations and be open to maybe an adult child that's trying to have these conversations with you. They have your best interest at heart. And even if it's, bringing in a third party, like myself, I do a lot of family mediation and a lot of family coaching. To have those conversations with you, that's also a good idea, because nobody should be trying to take away your independence. It should be the pursuit of dignity and the pursuit of your independence. And I would also encourage you, everybody on the call here, to engage in exactly what Melissa spoke about at the very top of this call. And that's try to begin to have these conversations and to begin thinking about these things when you're in the planning process. If you're beginning to recognize some of these things, or you just have a desire as the older adult that this is something that you want, begin looking around and begin planning, because very often families approach me when it's a fire drill, and we don't have as much time to make real quality decisions, and it's best to do this during a planning process rather than a fire drill. The host of this webinar, Arbor Company, they provide very good living environments for each of the scenarios that I've outlined. And I'm not going to get into those details right now. What I'd like to do is actually pass it on to Melissa at the end of my time, so that she can speak about some of those environments and how they can fulfill some of these things as we go forward. And then lastly, this is how you can get a hold of me if you decide that, or how to get a hold of any kind of a senior care authority advisor. So there's a bunch of me all around the country. We're in Northern California, and we're in Florida, we're in Texas, we're in Chicago. We're elder care consultants, and it's our job to guide you through this process in the pursuit of dignity. And we're happy to help you. So if you're in an area, all you need to do is go to seniorcareauthority.com, and you'll land on a website, and then just click on Find an Advisor, and you can see it. It'll be right there at the top of the page. You'll just put in your zip code, or you'll put in your town, and it'll bring up for you the elder care consultant that's in your area. And if you don't want to do all that technology, just call me at 770-631-5923. I'm happy to talk to you about whatever you need to chat about, or to put you in touch with somebody that's going to be able to take care of you. So thank you so much for listening to these stories. And it's my hope that if you are on this journey, that you find something that's going to make you happy, and it's going to enable you to thrive. And that's everybody on this call, not only the older adults, but the friends and the spouses and the adult children as well. So at this point, I'll pass it back to Melissa.
I think that deserves an applause. That was a great presentation, Chris. And I loved your examples, especially the example about Mr. Milton. And I do love the relationship that you have sort of picked up along the way by helping this gentleman and his family out. I think that is just wonderful. And you mentioned Arbor, right? So yes, Arbor does have many communities, over 45 to be exact, scattered across different places around the country. And yes, we do offer everything that you touched on today: independent living, assisted living, memory care. And we do have this, this other neighborhood that is quite special. It's called Bridges Neighborhood, and it bridges the gap between those who need a little bit of extra help, maybe beginning stages of dementia, but don't quite need all the help. So kind of between assisted living and memory care, we have what's called Bridges. So, and the cool thing about that, about these communities, and it goes back to what you were saying, is if you start in independent living, right, when there isn't an emergency, many of these communities, you can stay, you can just move down the hall or into the next neighborhood within the community to assisted living. So you're really looking at one move instead of multiple moves, depending on the level of care that you end up needing over the course of years. So it, you know, really try to think ahead on that end, because moving is traumatic for anybody, but especially when you're talking about your loved ones and our seniors. And I know that we've got some questions here, and some of them touch on that exact topic. So we have about a little bit more than 15 minutes until the top of the hour. So I see we've got questions. We're going to get to those. This is a good time to start typing those out into the Q&A box, or I see a few that are in the chat box as well. So Chris, let's get started. We've got first question from Melissa. What is your recommendation for someone who, after 2 years, repeatedly says, I was sent here to die and hate it here? They lived alone for 20 years after spouse passed until 95 in the same area and were uprooted to another state and independent living. Now it's almost time for assisted living for financial purposes. And I know you probably run into this quite often.
Yeah, I think it's the important thing is to have a conversation, you know, with the person that's saying I was. What was the quote that you said there,
The
Melissa?
quote is that they were sent here to die and they hate it here. And sometimes we hear, people will say, well, my mom and dad are saying this, but then they turn around and the people that actually, you know, see them on a day-to-day basis don't have that same reaction. So what is your experience on something like this?
Well, sometimes it can be the environment. There's all kinds of things that could make that older adult feel that way. You know,
Yeah.
the first most important thing to do is to have a conversation with that older adult to find out why they hate it there. I've, you know, the most important thing is, you know, when you're working or you're trying to figure out where the next place is that you want to make sure that it is a great fit for the individual. And there's 4 different considerations whenever you're thinking about that fit. Of course, there's location and there's budget. Those are very, very, you know, obvious things. You know, you want to be within a certain distance from the person that's going to be visiting most often, and you need to fall within a certain budget. But very often what's forgotten when you're doing this kind of move is the 2 other things, and that is social and recreational activity. So what is the culture like in that particular place? What's the culture that's been formed in there? And is that a cultural fit for the person that's actually moved in to that particular community? Let's say, for instance, you're somebody that's like Mrs. Vick, somebody that wants she wants to go to happy hours and have a great time, and she moves into more of a residential, quiet community. Well, that may not be a fit for her, and it may be that particular reason. The 4th thing is level of care, and of course, that's something that needs to be taken into consideration very carefully too. But in that equation, you know, when somebody says, I hate it here and I was sent here, that goes back to what I was talking about at the very beginning about that continuum of wants and needs. It's difficult when an older adult feels like they've been forced to move into a senior living community. And you always want to try to put them in the driver's seat in making that decision. You want to make sure that that's just a dignity thing, right? That's just, they have a say in whether or not they're going to do it. And then you've got to make sure that it's a good fit. Sometimes, you know, the caregiving staff, and this is no secret, there are, you know, there's assisted livings out there where, you know, caregivers are there's a struggle to hire caregivers. I mean, I can't put it any more bluntly than that. And sometimes it's a kind of a rotating staff where they don't have the same caregiver that they're seeing every single day. So if they're requiring assistance with some of these more intense activities of daily living, like bathing, to have to see somebody new every single day is tough. So there's so many factors that go into that question. It was a very loaded question, and it would really need to dig into kind of the origin story of how they moved into that community, and then what's going on inside that community. And would a move to a different community that maybe the older adult has a voice in choosing could be a huge benefit to that person.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And that's exactly where I was thinking too, that, once you looked at everything that is going on with the current community and it's still not going so well, maybe it's time for a fresh look, a fresh home, and maybe a fresh move. So Melissa, I hope that answers your question. The next one.
Just one more thing, Melissa.
Go ahead. Mm-hmm.
It could be something very easy to fix as well. So I work with a executive director at one of the Arbor Terraces at Crabapple. She's one of the best executive directors in the entire city of Atlanta. And we have a relationship where if an older adult, if something's going on, she calls me and I pick up the phone and I say, is there something that we can do? And very often there is a solution. Sometimes it can be as simple as a difficulty finding the remote. The remote's not in the right place, or my laundry's not being done enough. And so sometimes the solutions are more simple than we think. I just wanted to make that point as well, that work with the executive director at that community. They are your lifeline. They should be your liaison. And, you should have a great relationship with those executive directors.
Yeah. And hopefully the one where your father is at, Melissa, is one that can help you dig in and do that little investigative reporting if necessary to find out what exactly is going on. As he said, it could be a simple fix. So great answer, Chris. Next question comes from Anonymous. Advice for how to deal with a parent with dementia who will absolutely never agree to leave their house. They can no longer handle medication and meals properly and are also becoming a behavior problem. Crying and temper tantrums are occurring frequently. And again, this is something I'm sure you run into quite often.
Yeah, and this is something that we run into all the time. And this is a very, very difficult situation. And it really depends. We'd have to know the level of what stage this older loved one is actually in, because reasoning becomes very complex as dementia advances. If you're very early on, you still can have rational conversations and decision making still can be made, but as you advance, sometimes safety has to become the priority. And memory care communities are incredibly talented at what we refer to as intake or admission, and enabling somebody to assimilate kind of what that new environment's like and eventually adapt to it. It's not easy. I don't have an easy answer for this one. Sometimes it takes 60 days for somebody to truly assimilate into a new memory care environment. And a lot of times it's also very important that you're working with your doctor to make sure that that they've got the right kind of medication, anxiety medication, and other kind of medication to help them with aggression and all these different things that may be a behavior that's related to dementia. So it depends upon where they are. It's a difficult question for me to really exactly zone in, because there would be a different answer for each different situation. But I think the first thing I do is work with that gentleman's doctor and see if there's something that could be done to at least bring down that person's level of anxiety.
Yeah, and just an aside to that, for Anonymous in that question, and a few more that we have that are specifically talking about dementia and Alzheimer's, we have a few webinars where when a patient gets deeper into that diagnosis, in how you can start those conversations. And it doesn't become a fight or an argument. And it does take some finesse, but we had a webinar just a few weeks ago. You can find that at www.seniorlivinglive.com. We have a few dementia webinars based on dementia and how to speak to somebody who does need to make that move for their own safety. And that actually transitions us to the next question by Taylor, and it is about safety and dementia. Hello, Chris. If you could please advise me about the most helpful language to use with my mother to convince her that moving to memory care is her best interest for health and safety. She was diagnosed with Alzheimer's dementia over 2 years ago, and living in her home without assistance is becoming dangerous for her. Her behavior is now that at stage 4 or 5. So we have a level here. There are no family members, neighbors, or friends nearby who can look after her. I live 700 miles away, and our conversations have been difficult because she does not want to leave her home of over 50 years. I appreciate your advice. Thank you.
Yeah, it reminds me of the story that I shared with you about Mr. Milton. He was very, very happy down there in the villages. He was playing pickleball every day. He was actually a pickleball coach. His brother was there. He had all kinds of different friendships, and he was very, very happy. And you can imagine the emotion that's built into making a transition when you've been in your home for 50 years. There is such an emotional connection to that home. And without, it's difficult if you're 700 miles away and you're not able to have that daily interaction with the individual, because it is a gradual process. Where they're not immediately going to say, oh yes, this is something that I want to do. It takes time. But the most important things are to really be very clear about how much you care. Did she say it was her mother?
Let's see.
Her mother, the older loved
Yes,
one.
her mother.
Her mother. You've got to make sure that they understand that it's out of your pure love for her that you're doing this, and that you're not trying to force her into making a decision on her own, and that you understand why she's so connected to living in that home for all of those years. But then I do a program. Here's something that might be because I see a lot of these questions are falling into the same thing. I also have a program called Beyond Driving with Dignity. And that program is about very often when concerned families are nervous about their families driving, they'll resort to taking the keys away or letting the air out of the tires. So this program that we run called Beyond Driving with Dignity, it's a 3-hour one-on-one with the older driver. And a facilitator sits with them. And we have a learning conversation, and we take them through a series of predictive exercises that says how good they are at driving. Now, before those sessions start, the majority of them are insistent. I am going to continue to drive. This is what I'm going to do. We spend the 2.5 hours. And we ask them questions. When's the first time you started driving? How long have you been married? When's your birthday? When's your anniversary? All kinds of different questions. And then we take them through these series of exercises. And at the end of that, we go back and we present to them everything that they've communicated to us, and we show them the exercises that they complete. And very often they look at that and they're like, wow, I can't believe that. I didn't realize that this is what was going on inside of me. And at the end of that, they're the ones that usually make the decision. They're like, you know what? You're right. Maybe it is time that I retire from driving. And it's a similar situation to what you're sharing kind of with that. Sometimes it's about putting the evidence on the page and taking the time to show them the different activities that they're engaging in and everything, and saying, this is not safe, and we love you, and we want to make sure that you're safe. So, sometimes it comes into that. It's always about being gentle, though, and making sure that you're approaching it with a delicate hand.
Yeah, so I think, Taylor, what might be a good idea is to find somebody like Chris in your area that can come in and do something similar. Kind of maybe you go to visit your mother, and you guys all sit down with that third party, that sort of mediator that can help lay everything out for your mom. And so I would tell you, please contact Chris, and then find out who is like him in your area, and get together and see if that maybe helps move things forward with your mother so she can be safe. Great example there. We're going to continue through all these questions, guys. We're going to stay till they're all asked and answered. And I'm going to go sort of in the order from the chat to the Q&A box in which they appeared. So Lauren has a question. I enjoy the stories and what was learned from each case. My own mother's case is a little different. She's 91 with declining mobility, a depression era baby that has to buy her tissue paper at the dollar store, a classic introvert who is not interested in group activities and is obsessed with having all of her stuff around her. Independent living has been working great, but her declining mobility has me concerned about needing some additional assistance. Any advice on starting the conversation about parting with the stuff that is no longer, quote, necessary?
Well, the first thing that so this is another story. My wife is a senior real estate specialist. And what she does is she works with older adults, and she helps them with the sale of the home, the estate liquidation, and the move management. So very often what she does is she works with people that are making a move, and she helps them to identify those items that have a tremendous amount of emotional content associated with it. So it may be a painting, it may be a cup, it may be photographs, it may be something that is, very, very dear to them. And we don't know, we may assume, but we don't know why it's so dear to them. Mm-hmm. I think where I'd begin that conversation when you're talking about the stuff is talk about the stuff and allow your mother to share her stories about why some of those items are so important to her. I'm assuming she needs to get rid of that stuff because she's downsizing. It sounds to me like a move into assisted living would be an ideal situation. There's a tremendous amount of assisted livings where the culture is residential and not cruise ship like. So there are several different kind of communities that would fit her personality. But I would start with a conversation about those items. That's what my wife and her assistant do. They go through the house and they identify the things that have true meaning, and those are the things that make it into the new space. And everything else, we donate. So I think that's what I would start there.
Yeah. And the next question is from Federico. I am a Mexican citizen and would like to move to the U.S. to an assisted living community. What type of visa do I need to get from the U.S. government? And Chris, I don't know if you know that answer. I do have a little bit of information if you're not quite sure about that.
That's something I haven't addressed, so I will pass that on to you.
Yeah, so I'm looking, Federico, when you wrote that question, and it looks like that some countries do have retirement visas for foreigners, and it's usually called a silver card. However, the United States does not have a retirement visa program. So I'm not sure what route you would take on that end, but people like to retire to Mexico from the US and you want the reciprocal. I totally understand that. I'm not sure what that option would be without a retirement visa. That is a very good question though, and thank you for asking. And that may be a little bit out of the realm for our discussion today, but certainly a valid question. So I do thank you for being a part of that, and I hope that helped answer maybe a little bit of what you're asking there. Julie's question, is there a good way to incorporate when the two parents are at different levels? Mom can't take care of dad any longer. She can probably live on her own, but can't take care of dad. I would prefer to have them together, but not sure she would agree to moving, but know that dad needs to move.
This is a very common scenario that I encounter. I've got a family, a couple right now that I'm working with, where the husband is 83 and he's still jogging, 2 miles every single day, and mom has Alzheimer's and she's lost her mobility, and they live in their own home, and he didn't do any of the cooking or the cleaning or anything, and now suddenly he's doing everything, and it's difficult for him emotionally to make the move. But there are communities that have all of the different environments under one roof. So you've got independent living, assisted living, and memory care all under the same roof. And sometimes what'll happen is that they'll move into an independent living room. And that way dad gets to participate in all of the independent living communities, or I think it was maybe dad's the one that needs the care. Mom can participate in everything that she wants to participate, but dad can still get the care. Sometimes they'll move into assisted living, and that's also very good if they've got a long-term care policy, because the long-term care policy will cover that, will cover their expenses of moving into an assisted living room. Again, a mom still has the ability to go to the independent living section, but dad's there to get the kind of daily help with those ADL, the activities of daily living that he needs. So I'm not sure where what was the name?
Julie.
Julie, I'm not sure where Julie lives. In Atlanta, we have a lot of those different kinds of places. I'm sure we could put you in touch with somebody in your area who would know about whether or not those communities exist in your area as well.
Yep, and you hit it on the head right there. That's exactly what quite a few people do. I spoke to a woman in Texas who lives in independent living. Her husband needs help. He has dementia. He is in the getting help on the dementia side of the property. She's in the independent. She visits him. He gets his activities. She gets hers. And as she said, it's made her a better wife, because now she doesn't have the burden of the caretaking. She can just go love on him and be his wife. So
you remember the story of Mr. Rose, right?
Yeah.
Where they were able to reclaim that relationship of father and son.
Yep.
Imagine how much more important that is with husband and wife.
Right.
It's even at a different level. The word of caution: just make sure that you're moving into a place that is going to provide the assisted care, because you don't want to move them into this assisted living and mom's still doing all of the caregiving.
100% correct. Yeah, great stuff. The next question comes from Jackie. Building on that question that we just had, my spouse is 11 years younger than me. I'm 73. I need help with some things, and she can help me now, but we both have Parkinson's, and I know we will both need help at some point. When should we move? And I know the answer to this. Go for it, Chris.
You know the answer to it.
Now.
Well, the answer is to begin planning now.
Yep.
Don't wait. If you feel that the area that you live in is the area that you want to continue to live in, and you don't have family members that you want to move closer to, begin the planning process now. Begin working with an elder care consultant, so that so the process in working with an elder care consultant, somebody like me, is that we spend a tremendous amount of time on the front end doing what we've referred to as discovery. And we learn about you and your needs and your wants and your cultural needs, your social recreational preferences, all this stuff, location and budget. That is what it is. It's all the other stuff. And begin working with them now so that they can identify 3 places that are in your community that you are comfortable with and that you would want to move into and you'd get excited about. And then when you're ready to make the move, when you feel that it's just too difficult to manage daily life where you're currently doing, you've already made that decision. The hard part's done. But by the way, elder care consultants, when they're doing what we refer to as placement assistance, meaning they're helping you find a place to move into, there's no cost to you for the consulting fees, because wonderful companies like the Arbor Company appreciate the fact that they can work with elder care consultants, and they will compensate us for our consulting fees. So that's something. I'll never be nervous about reaching out to an elder care consultant, because 9 times out of 10, you're not going to have any, you won't have to pay any fees to them for all of this great advice and counsel that you'll be getting.
Yeah, and with Parkinson's, again, we're talking about affecting the motor skills. So just as he said, planning is great right now. So when it gets to that point, you can pull the trigger and make that move and be ready and know that you had the choice in that conversation. So Felicia's question: good morning. Thank you for all the information. My mother lives in South Florida, will be 89 next week. Happy birthday. She now walks with a walker, lives in a 2-story townhome with a combo bathtub shower rather than a standalone shower. Not ideal. She's fallen several times, was humiliated when paramedics had to lift her out. We spent 3 months and toured 8 facilities. Wow. Narrowed them down to 3 and have appointments to come for lunch at those 3 and look again at the accommodations and activities. While independent living is appropriate this time with maybe a bit of a shower help, and she can afford that comfortably, I do worry that prices will be prohibitive when and if she moves on eventually to assisted living. So the question for you: would the director or employee of a facility be able to tell us what to expect if she has to be moved on to the next level of care in the future? Thank you, Felicia.
So every single assisted living structures their pricing in slightly different ways. The most common way that they structure their pricing, this is assisted living, is that they will offer you a base rent, which would be kind of the independent living fees. And then on top of the base rent, they will give you different levels. I've seen 5 levels, I've seen 3 levels, I've seen points, I've seen all kinds of different ways that they structure those fees. But absolutely, 100%, they will tell you in advance what the different gradations will be before you elect to move into independent living. Usually, at least in Atlanta, the gradations are about $400 for a level 1. It goes up to $800 for a level 2, and then usually $1,200 for a max assist. And level 1 is usually needs some assistance, minor assistance with transferring and with dressing, and then it graduates from there. Medication management is sometimes built in, but usually a separate fee. But to answer your question, yes, don't move into a place if they don't tell you exactly how much your the cost of level of care is going to be.
100%. Yes. Excellent answer. And then we've got our final question coming in from Nicole. I recently started speaking with my dad about having someone come in, and he finally reluctantly agreed. I'm seeing behavior in line with the example of Mr. Milton. I'm beginning to think he needs to actually move to a memory care assisted living community and want to know how to start that conversation.
Well, we go back to Mr. Milton. It depends upon, are there things that are happening in the home that he's becoming aware of and that he's very unhappy with? What's his mood? Are you detecting that there's a heightened level of anxiety? Is there depression? Is he self-isolating? What are some of the behaviors that you're seeing that are giving you these indications? And as I responded to that to the earlier question, it's important that when you're at the early stages of dementia, your executive functions, the way that you order the world, is beginning to be challenged. So you may think that everything in your world is absolutely fine until somebody points out to you that it's not. And that's a very difficult for the person to accept, but they do accept it. They recognize when things are not the way they were. And there may be resistance, but it's about being patient and kind and not taking it personally when maybe they speak to you in a way that is not exactly loving. Imagine how frustrated somebody that's becoming self-aware of their own dementia is. It's a horrible thing. And we as kind of stakeholders, we as adult children, spouses and everything, sometimes we expect the person to behave in the way that they did pre-dementia, but that's just not the case anymore. And it's about having those really, really loving conversations, but also being really, really clear objectively about what's changing and why you think it might be good for them to make a change. So much of it goes into these conversations. I don't know. I'm even going to go back and listen to that. I wrote an article called "The Conversation," which is about how you begin to have these conversations with older adults. But I think the webinar that you've done would probably be an excellent way to address that as well.
Yeah, another great answer. And Nicole, I hope that helps. And Chris, as we wind down here, would you mind giving us again a telephone number or a way that people can reach out to you if they want to continue the conversation?
Sure. I'm just going to put it back up on the screen.
Okay. And while you're doing that, we'll say that you got a thank you from Taylor, and you also got a thank you most recently from our last question, which I believe was from Nicole. So yes, Chris did an excellent job, and thank you, Chris. Go ahead.
Well, thank you, and thanks everybody for listening in. It's much appreciated. So this is the best way to get a hold of me. Again, you can go directly to the website, but since we've got a captive audience here, if you want to just call me directly at that number, 770-631-5923, I'll know the person that's in your area, most likely, if they are in your area. I can give you a little bit of background on what they do, and I can refer you over to them. I also can talk through some of these things in a little bit more depth if you want to give me a holler. So that's the best way to get a hold of me. You can also do it right through seniorcareauthority.com and just click on Find an Advisor.
Perfect. Yeah, excellent job. Chris, great points today. And I do just want to say thank you so much for reminding all of us to put dignity at the top of that priority list when helping out our loved ones, making these difficult decisions. And they are difficult for sure. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us today.
Absolutely. And thank you for having me. And hopefully I'll have an opportunity to maybe speak to some of you in the future. So don't hesitate to give me a call. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thank you. And to answer the final question that came in from Frederico, he wanted to know if I want to listen to this webinar, how can I get it? Well, I've got the answer for you right here. All of you watching, including you, Frederico, you will get a copy of this webinar sent to your email that you RSVP'd with tomorrow. So starting tomorrow afternoon, check that email address. You can share that link of this webinar with your family, with your friends. You can rewatch it again. And if you missed some of the points and just want to take down some more notes, we're certainly happy to help. And of course, if those of you watching, you found this webinar informative and you want to listen to a few more, maybe about those dementia webinars we mentioned, please head on over to our website, www.seniorlivinglive.com. All of our content is about everything senior living. Thank you all so much for watching and for being a part of our conversation today. Have a great day, everybody.